how do you pass the science subtest of the elementary education K-6 exam? What are the big concepts you need to know? Do you know them? My name's Scott Roselle, and in this video, I'm gonna break down the specific concepts you have to know to pass the science subtest of the FTCE Elementary Education K-6. Whew, that's a mouthful, but I wanted to make sure you knew you were watching the right video for you. Now, how do I know what's on the test? Well, as a founder of 240 Tutoring, we create the best study guides for the FTCE exams. And as we were creating the study guide for the science subtest of the K-6, we came across certain concepts we know are gonna be on the test. So as you're studying, I wanted to share with you what we found so you can be prepared. So keep watching. So you'll have 70 minutes to complete the 55 multiple choice questions on the science subtest. And the K-6 science subtest can be neatly divided into 5 sections: scientific instruction, scientific process, physical science, earth and space science, and life science. So let's look at each of those 5 areas, and let's get started with scientific instruction. Scientific instruction really looks at how to teach science concepts and then how to assess how well your students are learning. Now, scientific instruction is going to make about 20% of the test. And there are 3 big concepts in scientific instruction that you need to know: scientific inquiry, lab safety, and scientific assessment. Now, the first big concept to know is the process of scientific inquiry. And scientific inquiry really relies on a few basic skill sets. Those skill sets are observing, predicting, classifying, inferring, and making models. And really, scientific inquiry is just the process of using those tools, the observing, predicting, and classifying, to help better understand the world in which we live. The next big concept that is important is lab safety. Lab safety is important because labs can be kind of dangerous and you don't want students to get hurt. That's not good. So you need to know the basic rules of lab safety. Rules like never put chemicals back into the container, always wear goggles, wash hands before and after experiments, direct the openings of containers away from the face, and don't eat or drink in the lab. Now, there's a lot of lab safety rules, and that was just a few of them, but you get the idea. You need to be familiar with how to keep students safe in a laboratory environment. And the last big concept to know is really how to assess students' scientific skills. So assessment really involves using formative and summative assessments to understand how well students are learning the knowledge and then planning curriculum instruction around that. Now, when I say formative versus summative assessment, those are 2 different kinds of assessments, and each one is important and used in a different circumstance. So make sure you know the difference between the 2 and when it's appropriate to use it, and also what the role of each one of those assessments is. So let's move on to the scientific process. The scientific process is really helping students understand the very structured way in which scientists observe, measure, and understand the world. The scientific process can make up about 18% of the K-6 science subtest. Now, just like with scientific instruction, there's 3 big concepts to know in scientific process. You need to know the scientific method, scientific tools, and the effects of science. Now, the first big concept is the scientific method. The scientific method is really just a set of steps in a research method so you can accurately and consistently understand the results of an experiment. Now, the scientific method may look a little bit different from grade to grade, and as you get more advanced, the scientific method might adjust just slightly. But there's a few basic steps that are always going to be in the scientific method. 1, make an observation. 2, form a question. 3, form a hypothesis. 4, conduct an experiment. 5, analyze the data. 6, draw a conclusion. 7, communicate the conclusion. Now, you need to be familiar with different ways in which the scientific method can change. That's a good starting point to understand how students need to generally progress through a scientific experiment. Next, we have scientific tools. Now, these include things like the metric system, data organizers, digital tools, and lab tools. You'll be using all of these to teach science and really make science engaging. And last, you need to have a general understanding of the effects on science, specifically science in society and politics and economics and government, on technology. I mean, it's a big concept, but you generally need to know how science affects different conversations in different spheres. So think about things like conservation, alternative energy sources, cloning, stem cell research, genetic testing, fitness and health, human reliance on fossil fuels, and many, many more. Now, in the scientific process, there are a few specific concepts I wanted to touch on just to make you aware of them so you can continue them in study. The first one is units of measurement and abbreviations. Essentially, you need to understand the metric system and how the metric system works. And within the metric system, there's various abbreviations. Abbreviations like kilo, which stands for 1,000 units, hecto, which stands for 100 units, deca, which is 10 units, deci, which is 1/10 of a unit, centi, which is 1/100th of a unit, and milli, which is 1/1000th of a unit. Now, different ways to remember those, like century, centi is 100 years, so centi's 1/100. Millennium is 1,000 years, so milli is 1/1000th. So just make sure you're understanding what these abbreviations or these prefix means to millimeter, centimeter, decimeter. They're very important on the test. Now, you also need to be familiar with different charts and graphs. Things like data tables, bar graphs, line graphs, pie charts. These are all very important to understand what they are and how they can be used and what data they show and represent. And when I say what data they show and represent, I really mean what is the most appropriate graph or visual representation to use for any given data set. And finally, have a rough idea of what lab equipment is. And these are some common lab equipment things that you really need to know what they are and what they're used for. A balance, a beaker, beaker tongs, graduated cylinders, microscopes, burners, and the eye wash station. So that's enough on scientific process. Let's move on to physical science. Now, physical science is going to test your knowledge in non-living systems. So think physics and chemistry and things like that. Now, physical science is going to make up 20% of the science subtest, so it's a very integral part of all the material you need to know. And again, there's 3 big concepts you need to know: force and motion, physical and chemical properties, and energy. Now, the first big concept is force and motion. Motion is simply the physical change in an object relative to a point of reference. And force is a push or pull of an object. So when you deal with things like motion and force, there's specific terms that are going to show up on the test and is used in science to help specifically identify which aspect of motion or force is being discussed. So you really need to know these terms and what they mean. Speed, velocity, acceleration, momentum, friction, inertia, mass, buoyancy, density, and work. And if you need help in some context to understand these terms, look up Newton's 3 laws. They're going to help you better understand how these terms fit into explaining the laws of motion. Now let's move on to the second concept: physical and chemical properties of matter. And by the way, when I say matter, I mean anything with mass that takes up space. So physical properties are the physical characteristics and features of matter, whereas a chemical property is a characteristic of a substance that changes in a reaction to the identity of a substance. So make sure you're familiar with different kinds of physical characteristics and chemical characteristics of matter. And the last big concept to know is energy. Energy is really the ability to do work or apply force over a given distance. And you should know energy is never created nor destroyed, it simply changes forms. And it can be transferred in a bunch of different ways. Now, there are 2 broad types of energy: kinetic and potential. You need to know what these 2 are and the differences between them, because that will come up on the test. And also know the different forms of energy like light and sound, chemical, physical, and how they're transferred. Now let's look at some specific concepts that are going to appear on the physical science portion of the K-6 science subtest. The first one is homogeneous versus heterogeneous mixtures. In a homogeneous mixture, all the substance is evenly distributed and looks the same. So think like air or water or blood, it all looks the same. In a heterogeneous mixture, all the substances are not evenly distributed. So think like a chocolate chip cookie. You can tell the difference between the different substances. So make sure you know the difference between the 2 mixtures. The next specific concept is going to be potential versus kinetic energy. Potential energy is just stored energy. So this is like a rock on the edge of a cliff or a snowball at the top of a mountain. It has the potential to roll downhill, and then the energy would go from potential to kinetic, because kinetic energy is energy in motion. When potential energy is used, it turns into kinetic energy. And finally, be familiar with Newton's laws. He has 3 laws. They're most likely going to come up on the test. They're very important, even just to understanding how best to teach physical science to students. Now let's move on to Earth and space science. This section is really about the Earth and its processes and space. It's very self-explanatory. Earth and space is going to make up 19% of the science subtest. And really, there are 3 big concepts that you need to know: Earth systems, weather and climate, the solar system and universe. Now, the first concept would be Earth systems, and this is just really knowing about the basic systems and structure of the Earth. So make sure you're familiar with the 4 layers of the Earth, the different levels in the atmosphere, and about plate tectonics. Now that can be a super broad material because there's so much that can be covered. I would recommend getting a study guide like the 240 Tutoring study guide that's really going to break down the exact Earth systems you need to know, explain them to you, and then give you authentic flashcards and, better yet, authentic practice questions so you best understand what you need to know for the test. Now the next big concept to know is weather and climate. And the difference between the two is just really one thing: time. Weather simply describes the atmospheric conditions over a set of a relatively short amount of time, and climate describes a set of atmospheric conditions over a set of a long period of time. And there's some important words to know when you're looking at weather and climate. Those words are humidity, seasons, wind, temperature, air pressure, density, water vapor, barometer, psychrometer, and the Coriolis effect. You should know what those words mean and how they come into play. Now, the third big concept to know is the solar system and the universe. Now, this is a big concept because, we're dealing with the universe here. But basically, you need to know what's out there in space. Things like the sun, what an asteroid is, what a meteor is, the asteroid belt, planets and stars, and the difference between the two and their general characteristics. Now, one specific concept that you really need to know for the Earth and space science is the lunar cycle. The lunar cycle has a big effect on the tides and the seasons, but it's also why we have full moons and new moons and half moons and quarter moons. So you need to understand how the relative position of the sun, Earth, and moon all affect those things. Another specific concept you need to know is the water cycle. And the water cycle basically looks how water goes from into the oceans, up into the environment, falls down on the land, affects the land, and then flows back into the ocean to continue the circle. And yes, I know not all water flows back into the ocean. Sometimes there's lakes, or like the Dead Sea, that the water just kind of stays there. It's important to know those things, but the water cycle generally looks at how water goes from a body of water into the atmosphere, back onto the land, its effect it has on land formations, and then back into the body of water. So important words to know relative to the water cycle are evaporation, condensation, humidity, precipitation, and surface runoff. And lastly, you need to know the characteristics of soil. You see, soil formation occurs with weathering and erosion of rocks. And there's 5 key things to know when it comes to soil: minerals, organic material, the living organisms, the water in there, and the nutrients. So understand the different aspects of soil and how they come about, and especially know the process of weathering and erosion on a rock formation. And the last specific thing you really know for Earth and space science are the major events in space exploration. Things like Sputnik was launched in 1957 and was the first satellite launched into space. In 1961, the first man, Yuri A. Gagarin, successfully orbited the Earth. In 1969, the first lunar landing on Apollo 11 makes Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin Jr., Buzz, and Michael Collins household names. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That happened on the Apollo 11 lunar landing. And then in 1990, the Hubble telescope is launched into space. And if you want something to do, just take a look at the Hubble telescope and the images on Google. Just Google images, Hubble telescope. You'll be amazed at what's out there in the universe. And again, if all this stuff with Earth and space science seems like too much to understand in just one thing, or you don't know where to start, or you don't know what's important or not important, just go ahead and get the 240 Tutoring Study Guide, because it's going to break down every concept you need to know. We'll explain it, we'll give you flashcards and those authentic practice questions so you know how you'll need to know the information on the test. Now, the next big area is life science. It covers 23% of the test, which makes it the largest area on the K-6 science subtest. And really for this, there's 3 big things that you need to know: living things, evolution and change, and genetics. Now, the first big concept to know is living things and really what the life cycle is. So with the life cycle, you need to understand how things go from birth to maturity and then to death. Especially look at a few different organisms like the butterfly and the frog. Those life cycles are pretty unique, and so the test is going to focus on those life cycles in particular. And when it comes to life cycles, make sure you understand how things are classified in the 6 different kingdoms and the different orders of classification. Like, of the 6 kingdoms, you can get very specific and go into the classifications like phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So make sure you're aware with the taxonomic structure of classifications of living organisms. The second big concept to know is evolution and change. You see, both living and non-living things are constantly interacting with each other and having an effect on one another, especially the non-living on the living organisms. And so living organisms, change in response to their environment. And after a while, the environment can change in response to a group or a selection of living organisms. And so make sure you understand how evolution impacts change and change impacts evolution. And when it comes to this, there's a few terms that you have to know. So I would recommend defining these terms and understanding their impact and their place in the evolution and change concept. Evolution, adaptation, population, extinction, natural selection, selective breeding, and mutation. And finally, the last big concept to know is about genetics. So you need to understand a Punnett square and how genetics impacts in that Punnett square. And specifically, genetics can sometimes be more of a vocabulary test because you have to know specific vocabulary to get the test right. So the vocabulary you have to know in regards to genetics is traits, heredity, sperm, egg, allele, gamete, meiosis, mitosis, genotype, phenotype, dominant, and recessive. And in addition, know what DNA and RNA is. Now, if I just listed out a bunch of concepts that you weren't really familiar with and terms that you don't know if you can even learn or how they work in, again, a 240 Tutoring Study Guide is going to have this all laid out in an exact way you need to know and very easy to understand. We're going to have flashcards for all the key terms. We're going to have instructional content that explains how it all works together. And we're going to have practice questions which very clearly and succinctly tell you how you need to know this information on the test, because they're authentic and they're going to be fantastic. So let's look at a few specific concepts that might come up in the life science section of the test. The first is you have living organisms and then non-living things, and you really need to know what defines the difference between the two. For instance, there's 7 characteristics of a living organism. They use energy, they have movement, they breathe, they get rid of waste, they grow and develop, they respond to their environment, and they reproduce. Now, some non-living organisms could have some of those characteristics, but a living organism is going to have all 7. Another specific concept that you need to know are the various systems of the human body. And these systems include things like the circulatory, the digestive, the endocrine, the lymphatic, the muscular, the nervous, the reproductive, the respiratory, and the skeletal systems. Now, your body is a very complex organism and it has different systems to accomplish different functions. You need to know what those different systems are and what functions that they accomplish. And finally, you need to know photosynthesis, what photosynthesis is and how it's used. Photosynthesis is one of the foundational systems of life, and it's very important and it will come up on the test. So now I'm gonna give you a few questions straight from our 240 Tutoring Study Guide to help you better understand how this information is going to be asked on the test. Now I'm gonna give you the question and the answer options, and I'd recommend pausing the video, really thinking about the question before I give you the answer. So let's get started. Climate is different than weather because weather, A, changes on a daily basis, B, is a measurement of air movement, C, depends on the angle of the sun's rays, or D, is the average weather conditions for an extended period of time. The correct answer is A, because weather changes on a daily basis and climate is the average weather condition measured over an extended period of time. Now this particular question was a little bit easier for you since I just covered it in the video, but I want to warn you, not all questions are going to be as easy. What inference could you make if the genotypes of 2 parents did not show the recessive phenotype, but the recessive trait was visible in their offspring? A, both parents were purebred, one carried 2 of the recessive alleles and the other carried 2 dominant alleles. B, both parents were hybrids and carried 1 recessive allele for the recessive trait. C, one parent had 2 dominant alleles and the other was a heterogeneous for the trait. D, neither parent had the recessive allele. The correct answer is B. A dominant recessive hybrid and a dominant recessive hybrid would not show the recessive trait, but 25% of their offspring could have a genotype of the recessive trait, lower TT, and the recessive trait would be visible. See what I mean? Not all questions are as simple as question 1. Question 3, which system controls the function of the body? The muscle system, the nervous system, the digestive system, or the circulatory system? The correct answer is B. The nervous system contains the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. The brain controls all the functions of the body. Question 4, students can be administered different types of assessments. One type of assessment is referred to as a formative assessment. Which of the following statements best describes a formative assessment? Formative assessments measure what students know at the end of a unit. Formative assessments are given at the end of each year. Formative assessments are given at the end of each grading period. Formative assessments measure what students know along the way. The correct answer is D. Formative assessments measure what students know along the way. They should be given on a regular basis. Formative assessments are not summative assessments, which are used to determine what a student knows at the end of a year or at the end of a unit. Finally, question 5. Which of the following types of energy is stored in a battery? Heat, mechanical, chemical, or potential? The correct answer is C. Heat is an energy. It's not a kind of energy like chemical, mechanical, or potential.